Okay, this is the review or the review for our ETA, our end of term assessment for the first 9-week grading period. Going to quickly go through the things that you're going to see on the test tomorrow. The test begins with map locations. Once again, just like we did to start the school year, you need to be able to look at a world map and identify where North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia are. You also need to be able to point out the equator on the map and the Atlantic, Pacific, Arctic, and Indian Oceans. So if you're unsure, since you're on the computer watching this, go to Google, do a Google search for a world map or a continent map, and take a look at that. Make sure you know those locations. Most of you had that we're pretty good about that at the end of that unit, so I think you'll be okay. But make sure that you can name the continents and oceans and identify where the equator is on the world map. There are also questions about the climate regions of the world that you'll have to deal with. The 5 climate regions: temperate, tropical, dry, polar, and highland. Remember, temperate is a type of climate that we live in, where you have all 4 seasons, 4 distinct seasons: hot summers, cold winters. Tropical is the type of climate that's normally found along the equator. It's hot to warm all year round and rainy. Dry climate regions are regions like deserts and steppe, where it's hot during the day, cool at night, and there's very, very little precipitation, very little rain. Polar climates are cold year-round, and they're found at the north and south poles, which is why we call them polar. And highland, or high land, is the climate regions that are found up in the mountains at higher elevations or altitudes. Make sure that you know your forms of government. A democracy is where citizens vote for their leaders. It's a type of government our country has. A dictatorship is when you have one all-powerful leader who makes all the decisions. A monarchy is when a country is ruled by a king or a queen. And communism is a government where the government controls all aspects of life and owns all property. It owns all the businesses. People in a communist country, along with a dictatorship, have very little freedom. In a democracy, there's a lot more freedom for individuals. And monarchies aren't as common nowadays, but when we study the Middle Ages, we'll talk quite a bit about monarchies, about what it was like when kings and queens ruled most of the countries of Europe. Cultural diversity, having lots of different cultures in one area. When you have people that are of different religions, races, have different traditions, but are all part of the same community. We live in a culturally diverse country. Our city is culturally diverse. Our school is culturally diverse. Cultural diffusion is the idea that culture spreads from one place to another. An example would be basketball, a game that was invented in our country, but is played in countries all over the world now. Culture changes because of innovations, which are new ways of doing things. You take something that already exists and you improve on it, try to make it better. Inventions, which are totally new things or ideas, like the television, the telephone, the automobile. Those are all inventions that change the culture of the world. And diffusion, of course, causes culture change. When culture spreads and you're exposed to new cultures, new ways of thinking, new traditions, new forms of music, new foods, those are all examples of cultural diffusion. Okay, a couple of ideas or thoughts about population that you need to be familiar with. Population simply means the number of people living in a certain area. So the population of Portage means how many people live in our city. Population of China, we talked about, is well over 1 billion people now. That's how many people live in that particular country. Population changes. It constantly changes. And the 3 main factors are birth rate, how many babies are born in a certain area during a certain time period, the death rate, which is unfortunately the number of people that pass away, and migration, the idea that people are constantly moving in and out of different areas. Those 3 things together affect how populations change. Population density is the idea that the more people there are in one particular place, the more dense it is. Large cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles are very population dense. There are a lot of people living per square mile in those places. If you think about it, in Chicago, there's lots and lots of tall buildings, apartment buildings, where they build up and not out. In Portage, most homes are 1 or 2 stories. and one family lives there at a time. But in a large city like Chicago, they build straight up multiple stories, and on every floor there's multiple apartments, so lots of people can live in the same space. So a big city like Chicago would be more population dense than a small town out in the country like Couts, which is just south of here, because Chicago has more people living every square mile. If you draw a square 1 mile on every side in the city of Chicago and count up how many people live there, and take a map and draw another square in Couts, Indiana, and count up how many people live there, there's going to be a huge difference between the high number of people living in that square in Chicago and the really low number of people living in that square down in Couts. Okay, a couple of things about the economy that you'll see on the test. Make sure that you're clear about the difference between a developed versus a developing country. Developed countries are wealthy. They have a high gross domestic product. There's lots of technology in a developed country. There's a good healthcare system. High literacy rate, which means people's ability to read and write, which is tied directly to getting a good education. And people, generally speaking, have a higher quality of life. They live longer. They're healthier. There's jobs available to them. So that's a developed country. The United States is a developed country. Most of the countries of Europe, places like Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, they're developed countries. Canada is a developed country. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, those are developed countries. Developing countries are countries that are economically poor. They have a low gross domestic product. They don't produce much. There's not many jobs available for the people that live there. They have very little technology. And when I'm talking technology here, it doesn't even necessarily mean things like cell phones and computers and iPads. It means having electricity in your home, having running water in your home, having a car to drive. Those types of technology are lacking in many developing countries of the world. They have poor healthcare systems. Healthcare isn't available everywhere. It's not up to the standards that we have in our country. You might have to travel for hours to get to the nearest medical facility, where in Portage, you can get to an emergency room in a matter of minutes. People in developing countries have low literacy rates, which means they're not educated to the same level. There's more people that can't read and write, because instead of going to school, they're having to try to find ways to help their family survive and make money and put food on the table. And generally speaking, all of this adds up to a low quality of life in developing countries. Unfortunately, more people in the world live in developing countries than in developed. About 2/3 of the world's population lives in what's considered a developing country. You find developing countries in South America and Central America, in the Caribbean islands, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. And the people that live there live a much, much different lifestyle than we live in our country. We're very fortunate to live in a developed country like the United States. A few more, or two more things as far as the economy goes that we want to talk about. A market economy is what we have in the USA, in our country. It's where people can privately own businesses. There's free trade, which means you can pretty much buy or sell anything you'd like to buy or sell, as long as it's not illegal, and you can set whatever price you want. There's competition in a market economy. That means there's not just one grocery store in Portage. There's a variety of grocery stores, which is good for the consumers like you and I, because if there's more than one grocery store, then the grocery stores are going to compete for customers, and the main way they compete is by trying to keep their prices low so that people will go to their grocery store as opposed to someone else's. If there was only one grocery store in Portage, they could charge high prices because there would be nowhere else for us to go shop without leaving the city. So in a market economy like the United States has, you have a lot of competition, you have a lot of choice when it comes to buying things, and prices are relatively controlled. In a command economy, the government owns all the businesses. The government then sets the prices. The government determines what choices you'll have as far as what you can and can't buy. You find command economies more commonly in communist countries than in dictatorships, where the governments have total control of everything. All right, let's wrap things up real quick. Some things about the Earth that go back to the first chapter or two. Don't forget about our idea of plate tectonics, that the Earth's crust is made up of plates that move and shift, causing earthquakes, volcanoes, rifts or valleys, mountain ranges. Tied in with plate tectonics is this idea of Pangea, the theory that hundreds of millions of years ago the continents were all one big supercontinent. And then they slowly, over hundreds of millions of years, broke apart and drifted away to their current locations. Natural resources. Natural resources are things that we get from the earth, things like coal, oil, trees, gold, any of the crops that we grow, the animals that live on the earth. All of those things that the earth provides for us are natural resources. Some of those resources are renewable, like trees. If we chop down trees, we can then grow more trees. The wind is a renewable resource. We can harness the wind to create electricity. Water is a renewable resource. But others are non-renewable, and those are primarily the fossil fuels like coal and oil. Those are the type of things that once we remove all of the coal and oil and natural gas from the earth, those things are going to be gone. So natural resources fall basically into those two realms, either renewable or non-renewable. And finally, the water cycle. The water cycle works under the basic idea that there is a set amount of water on Earth. The amount of water on Earth today is the same as the amount of water on Earth 1,000,000 years ago. Water evaporates into the atmosphere. It turns into a gas. It condenses in the clouds, which means it cools and becomes a liquid again. And eventually, when enough is built up in the clouds, it falls back to Earth as precipitation. I'm not sure what these extra letters are at the end. Let me get rid of them. That's better. Okay. If you understand the things that are on this review, you should do very well tomorrow on our ETA. So listen to this video a couple of times, and I think you'll be all set.